For those of you that are on already, we will start up right at the top of the hour. Could anyone who's listening, could you please put your hand up in the with the little hand up button so I know that everyone can hear me at this time? Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I appreciate it. All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. It is 12 o'clock. We'll go through some of the logistical stuff here in the beginning. And if we have some attendees that are still trying to get on, we'll go ahead and that'll give them a chance to get on if they're running a little late. But we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so if you haven't attended one of our previous webcasts, or if you're new to the GoToMeeting interface that you're actually using, there's a few things that you should know about it. The little button that you see, the little orange arrow button right there that you see, actually will minimize that interface, so it makes it so you can see the rest of the screen. Sometimes that screen sticks out and you can't see what you actually have on there. So that will actually minimize your screen, makes it easy. You can fly that interface in and out with that button. Also, there's that, that's interesting. Okay. Also, there's that raise the hand thing. Honestly, that won't work too much. We're going to wait for questions to the end. We'll talk about that here in just a second. And then also, if you're struggling with one or the other, you can switch between if you have mic and speakers or your telephone that you have. Okay. Let's see if I don't think, yeah. Okay. So if you do have a question at any point in time during the webcast, I'll wait to answer those at the very end, just so we can get through the amount of information that we need to get through. So if you do have a question, put it down into the questions for staff. I'll keep it at the end, and then I'll answer any of those that are down there. I usually leave about 10 minutes towards the end of the webcast so that I can answer anything that anyone has. If you haven't been on the webcast or any of our webcasts before, for the most part, this is still all the same information if you have, but if you haven't, we are CDT, a value-added reseller for PTC. If you are what is called a direct customer of PTC, you usually don't deal with the value-added resellers. The value-added resellers' role with PTC and with essentially the Windchill and Pro environment or ecosystem is that you think of it as PTC being Ford and we're the Ford dealership, right? So we resell software. We do implementations, consulting, education, essentially the whole nine, but we just do it for customers that are not John Deere and Raytheon. Some of this, not the way that PTC describes it is called small to medium-sized businesses, and it's usually right in between, right around the $250 million range and below that we deal with directly. We are a part of a company called Barry-Wehmiller, which essentially is, you think of it as a parent company of us. We are now the largest reseller in the country. Barry-Wehmiller, I'm going to pick that. Hopefully that'll change that. I'm going to, we were bought by Barry-Wehmiller, I don't know, about 1.5 years ago. It gave us much more of a backbone as far as support and capabilities and financial stuff. So we are growing fast. We purchased a few VARs here in the last 6 months. For those of you that know in the past, we've been in Kansas City, Arlington, and St. Louis for a while. We picked up about a value-added reseller on the East Coast, and now we have training facilities in Charlotte, essentially right outside of Philadelphia in New Jersey, and then also now in Orlando. And I'm sure here in the next few more months, we'll probably have some places on the West Coast also. We do support and only support PTC products, so all of the PTC product suites that are out there, we support all of them in all forms. We also are one of the top training VARs in the country. One thing that we emphasize in our training is that we'd like to establish the relationship with the customer and not just kick you in and out the door. So we will run classes with one student. And so again, it just kind of provides more of a relationship instead of just having you pay money for training. So if at any point in time, if you have some training needs or some training wants, our schedules are always out on the PTC websites like any of the other training schedules that you find, but also you can find them on our website, which you see at the bottom. If you do not find a class that you want to take that is available at that time or in that time frame, we will gladly add that class onto the schedule in any one of our facilities to meet the needs, whether it's 1 or whether it's 10, whatever it may be. We'll gladly add that to accommodate you. So if you have any training needs around that, we're more than welcome to help out. That's me at the top. I am Ben. Been around with CDT for, I don't know, since the beginning of CDT, but actually before that. So it's been about 8 years now, and I'm also the training manager for CDT, so I can obviously help with all the training stuff. Okay, so we are here today to talk about Creo admin. It's one of the more, how shall we say, sensitive subjects when you start going into some customers. A lot of times, most of the stuff that you find and most of the knowledge that you find is things that you just gather over time. There are not any PTC web courses that take you through Creo admin. Essentially, it's stuff that you pick up here and there on blogs, through the install documents, and everywhere else you can possibly do it. Me being around, essentially doing implementations and working with customers over the past 8 years, I picked up a number of different things that help out and kind of standardize the way some companies are doing some of these things. So we'll cover a number of different things today, just some software behavior when it comes to standard concepts, and then we'll also, if you look at the very top one that's really nice, is if you haven't been on PTC.com lately, they revamped the entire support web page. I'll hold my opinion about it just yet. I'll kind of show it to you, some good. You got to kind of get used to what it looks like and how they've kind of put the flow together, but at least now you'll have your first glimpse into it and kind of be able to see how some of those things work, okay? So here's our agenda for the day. Again, some good stuff, and as you have questions, feel free to ask those questions, and I'll get those answered towards the end of class, or in the class, towards the end of the webcast. All right, so software downloads and licensing, and we'll cover some other stuff. So usually when I go into a customer of mine, I try to impart some ideas of just about general admin concepts on them, because a lot of times they won't have someone. And even if it's a customer that's had Pro-E for a while, a lot of times the Pro-E admin leaves and someone else is doing it, and they have a lot of questions around a number of different things, okay? And so some of the most basic, very upfront things that you always have to ask yourself when you start talking about Pro-E admin is versions of software, why we are upgrading at any point in time, what's new from certain versions to no versions. So when you have a piece of software and times are moving along and people are upgrading, why are we upgrading? Why are we doing some of this stuff? Once we upgrade, how is our hardware going to work with all this stuff? I'll kind of just show you to where some of these things are. Here essentially is the new interface for the PTC website, and I'm going to kind of be going back and forth between my PowerPoint here, but we're actually going to log in and I'll show you it here real time, okay? So under the support page, you will see essentially now the new interface for support. Now, before, to be honest with you, everybody knows that the PTC web page or PTC.com, it was not an easy website to navigate in any form. A lot of things were in different places, and if you didn't know where stuff was, it was a little bit more difficult to find things, okay? So what you see now when you go to the support page is a little bit more of an interactive page. First of all, when you log in, essentially this is your support page. So it's kind of like, if you know what Windchill is, and if you've used Windchill, it kind of looks like and has the same feel as far as a home page. Essentially, you have the ability to add and take away any one of these tabs that you see fit. And that's why you see these little arrows jump up and down at you when you hold your mouse over something, okay? So you can take away some of these tabs, you can add specific tabs. If I hit the Add tab button, not that we have a lot of customers using some of this other stuff, but here are some of the other buttons essentially you can shove into your interface, okay? So if you're only dealing with certain things, you don't care about ArborText or MathCAD or Co-Create, you can eliminate those, all right? Now, as you drag down, okay, there are some very important things to realize about your home page. One of the best ones right here is that you will see, here is your Update Advisor, okay? In the Update Advisor, you will see what product you have. So if I come down here and say Creo Parametric, and if I go from, I want to move from Wildfire 3 to, from a certain date code, let's say something like this, to Wildfire 4 and another specific date code, you will see, and if I hit search right here, and there's a lot of stuff that shows up, all of the enhancements and all of the things that they have fixed from Wildfire 3 to Wildfire 4. So this is the Update Advisor that was on the previous web page, but here it is right now. So now you can see all of the things that you want if you're moving from one to the next. Did they fix this? Did they fix this specific bug that they had? You will see that here in the Update Advisor, and it tells you all of those things so you can have a good place to fix them, okay? So right under the home page, it does not show up. It does not show up. At least I don't think it shows up. Let's go back to, so if I hit Creo, maybe it is down here. Let's look down here. Nope. So if I am here, notice how if I go to the Creo page, it's only in the home page that you will find that Update Advisor, okay? Only in the home page that you'll find that. Also, for what's new, right? If you ever want to know, if you ever move from one version to the next and you're not taking the update, how do you know? Essentially, there's that big What's New PDF. In the big What's New PDF that you can find those in whatever tab you're in. So if you go to Creo, and if you come down under Creo Reference Documents right here, there's Creo Reference Documents. This takes you to the same page that's always been on the PTC website, where I can say I want all documents and all user roles for Creo Parametric 2.0. I'll hit the Browse button, and then usually, to be honest with you, I always drag it to the bottom. There it is. You see what's new in Creo Parametric 2, Direct and Simulate. You pick it, and you can go grab that PDF. And it doesn't give you picks and clicks details about what's new, but it talks about some of the new tools and some of the enhancements that they have. But that's where you will find the new, or essentially the what's new documents if you're ever making the switch from one version to the next. Okay? Also, if we back up here, you will find the platform support, or essentially all of your compatible hardware under here under platform support. Now, what's interesting about this is that if I pick Creo Parametric 2.0, right, it shows me this guy right here, right? If you go to Pro Engineer here, you will also see it does segregate it, right? So depending on what tab you're in, here's Wildfire 4, or excuse me, yeah, 5, 4, and 3. So it does segregate it depending on the tab that you are in. You will find essentially the platform support. Let's look in the home page. I can't remember in the home page if that platform support's in the home page also. I don't think, yep, here's platform support right here. So here's platform support, but again, it takes you to the old link where at this point in time you then need to go down and then find which one you want, and then it takes you to the same spot. So you have essentially have a generic search for platform support in the home page, or you have at that point in time, you know, the two different tabs would be a little bit more specific to what you're trying to find. Okay. All right. So just some links and some navigation in the PTC website, some popular things that you probably have used in the past to again evaluate downloads and new stuff that you want to use for previous or for newer versions that you might be installing. Okay. Also now, if I go back here to the home page, you can find this in the individual ones. But if I go to essentially Creo, you will see now PTC software downloads. Okay. For those of you that, again, depending on what version you have, sometimes this is a little bit confusing. Some guys are still Wildfire 4, some are 5, and some are Creo 1 and 2. Usually when you go to the download page of Pro Engineer, you usually won't have all of this. I have all of this just because I'm an AE and I have a lot of different software that I can use. But what you'll find is under Creo Parametric and Pro Engineer, you will find all of the releases of software that PTC allows you whenever your maintenance contract was to download. You'll find them right here, right? Creo 1, 2, Wildfire 5, and if you hit the expand button, you'll see this information. Now, if I go ahead and hit the expand button for this guy, if I say show all date codes again, essentially you can just filter off the piece of software that you want to download. It makes it a little bit easier. Notice how there's Creo Elements Pro 5.0, and then there's also, this is all for our Wildfire 5 guys. Let me do this again. Let's minimize that. There we are. So Pro Engineer Wildfire 5.0 and then Creo Elements Pro 5.0, they are actually essentially the same pieces of software. When PTC went through their branding change, there was M codes up to a certain point under Wildfire 5, and then they went through the rebranding, and then then it was called Creo Elements Pro 5.0. Fundamentally, they are exactly the same piece of software. It's Wildfire 5, except at this point in the major release, or essentially Wildfire 5 release, they went from this branding right here, this guy right there, to this branding. There's a lot of times when I'll go into customers and they'll be running essentially this right here, and they think it's Creo. Yes, by name it's Creo, but it's not within the context of Creo Parametric. Okay, so if you ever have confused about some of the naming chains that you have, anything that is under Wildfire 5 technically is Wildfire 5. This is just the rebranding name that they went through. Again, it goes essentially from this guy right here as far as M codes, this one right here, and there you have it. All right, so just a little bit of an explanation and differences in the downloads that you have right there. Okay. All right. Let's make sure I'm still on track with this guy. Okay. So Creo, the Creo 1 and 2 downloads. If you haven't downloaded Creo 1 and 2 lately, if you do notice when you go to expand this guy and you look right here, notice how there is obviously the download right here, but now the help files are actually an entire separate download from the essentially the software download. Before, all that stuff was bundled together. Now you actually need to download the Help Center files separately from the actual the regular pieces of software. It's different from what it was done in the past. So if you find that you go to Help and you cannot use Help, it's because you have not downloaded the Help files. You can do that again directly from under here. You hit the install button, they install in the appropriate spots, and there are your Help files. Okay, so a little bit of a tidbit if you're having trouble with that. It is a little bit different from some of the Wildfire 5 stuff that's been done in the past. All right, so there's all of the downloads. Some important things to kind of talk about this, and these all kind of work together. Versioning, essentially downloads in general, and then also licensing. One of the key components, one of the key things that I find is that if I go walk into a customer and they've had Pro-E for a long time, and they had an admin, and now they have a new admin, they want to do all this stuff, but they are not essentially, whether it's the licensing admin, which you see right here, or essentially they are not an admin of essentially their company on PTC.com. If you are a new customer, when you sign up for your account, it asks you, do you want to be essentially the online admin? Once you say yes, you have all of these permissions. If you are not the admin and you want to become the admin, either your current admin must allow you to do that, and that can be done here if I go back up to my account, excuse me, and if I go into account management, and then from here under your support settings, right, you go to manage employee privileges, and then they have licensing and they have software access, right, those type of things. You essentially just make check marks. The problem with this is if you are not the admin and you don't know who the admin is, which I run into a number of different times, how do you become the admin? Before, you essentially could just call PTC and you say, hey, I want to become the admin, and it wasn't a big deal, and they would just say, okay, these people are gone, no problem, we can make you the admin. Now, at least lately, if you want to become the admin, you have to send or email or mail in any form, essentially PTC with a letter with your company's letterhead on it stating that you want to become the admin. I think they've kind of pulled back because anybody could call them and say, hey, this person's not the admin, I want to become the admin, and then they probably got some maybe people were doing something they weren't supposed to do, and so now you have to be prove a little bit more that you want to be the admin and you are a part of that company. So whether it's an email with the company letterhead on it or something like that, you literally now have to submit something to PTC says, I want to become the admin, and then you can get that done. So I've had to do that a number of different times at companies when they've had some admins that leave, and it made it a little bit more difficult, but it is what it is, okay? So being the admin, again, it gives you the ability to do that. It also gives you the ability to do some license management. One of the things that I get into discussions with customers with is that PTC licensing, right, it can be kind of a bear if you're not used to it in a number of different ways. A lot of times there are questions around do we do licensing on individual machines? Do we do licenses on servers? How do we update licenses? How do we do some of those things? One thing to realize about PTC licensing is that those text files that you get from PTC at that time, they are only valid for whatever release of software is at that time. So whenever you update from a Creo or from a Wildfire 5 to a Creo 1 or Creo 1 to Creo 2, you have to reissue that license. If we go back to our website here, if you notice, if I come back out to the PTC website, I guess I could have went to support, directly into support, notice how now that you won't see, well, at least I can't remember. Again, I'm new to the website also. Here we are, okay. Software downloads, no. Let's go look at Creo. Now, under Creo, you will now see configure new software, reconfigure software licenses, and retrieve existing licensing pack. So if you are just updating from Wildfire 5 to Creo 2, you will need to retrieve existing licensing packs. If you are reconfiguring, if you're moving your license server from one machine to the next, you do it under reconfigure. And then if you have bought new software, then you can do the configure new software and assign it to, again, any server or any laptop or whatever it may be, depending on what you're trying to assign your license server to. So you will find that now under the Creo or, again, under the Pro Engineer tab or whatever it may be. But now they have put that into the license management, and you will see that all right here. Okay, so here are those 3 picks that you should be aware of. All right. Just some generalities about licenses and some things that I have experienced in my time dealing with some of this. is that most companies want to be able to control their licenses on a server, and that's absolutely fine. The problem that they get into is when they want a laptop that they want to take off-site. In previous years, I guess you could say, PTC was a little bit more lenient, even though they don't, and I shouldn't say that, they still had legal statements that said you're not supposed to do this, but they didn't have essentially a tracking mechanism that if you spawned a license, that it would report anything, even though they might not openly say it. We've seen that the fraud department at PTC get much larger, and because of that, there might be some things now, especially with Creo, that are actually reporting back that are saying, hey, there's this many licenses, there's this many in use. I don't know if they'll ever come out and say that directly, but whenever you're doing licenses, we've kind of gone away from the, as long as you're in the spirit of the law, as long as you're not breaking it, we don't care that you might spawn a license as long as you're not using the many. But now I think PTC is starting to lock that down a lot more. And so you start getting into situations as how do you put a license on a laptop and how do you walk away with it? Well, there's still always the borrow mechanism. It's now called parametric borrow. It used to be just borrow.bat. Now it's parametric borrow, where you can check out a license from your server. If you do use the borrow, you have to take a license for a certain amount of days. You can't break it down into hours, and you can take it that way. If you want to, if you're dealing specifically with a lot of engineers that have laptops, you can install license servers on individual laptops, and now they become their own essentially contained unit. Or also, you could create some type of VPN access. I have found that VPN access a lot of times is slow if you have guys that are out in the field and doing with that. So you have to kind of take an evaluation of what your environment is, what fits you, and what's going to help you out the best, and what your IT staff, or in some cases you, can handle with setting some of these things up. So a number of different decisions that go into something like that. There's always a lot of different ideas when it comes to it, but it's something that you have to kind of take into consideration when going through some of this. Okay? So just some different ideas, some things that I've dealt with in different companies, and again, all of them fit in certain ways. All right. Oh, one thing that I will say about putting, if you do put a licensed server on a laptop, and this is kind of a big one that until you kind of get in this situation, you don't know exactly what this is. But Windows, Microsoft Windows, as a software by default, okay, if you have a laptop, in 99.9999% of the cases, they will have a landline Ethernet card and then also a wireless card, okay? And you have to be very careful with this. By default, when you get a laptop, all of the power settings on your laptops are pretty much set to the minimum to where you're not going to eat up your battery. Well, one of the things to realize about that is that one of the settings is that if your wireless card is not being used, it will turn it off. The problem with that is that if you go to get a MAC address from your machine, and let me show you this, right? If I go get a MAC address, you will see two different MAC addresses, and you can assign essentially your Pro Engineer license to your wireless and your Ethernet. A lot of times, if you don't know some of these power settings, what happens is they'll take, I've seen users take the very first MAC address that they see right here and they apply it, which is fine, until they unplug something or they plug in their Ethernet card and the not Pro Engineer, but Microsoft turns off that Ethernet card, and then all of a sudden, when you try to fire up Pro E, it dies on you, okay? In almost all cases, if you were creating a self-contained unit on a laptop, and it's easier to put it into or assign it to the Ethernet because it does actually, the software does not turn off the Ethernet adapter. Or if you really have to assign it to the wireless card, you have to get into the power settings of Pro Engineer and also that card's configuration and make sure that there are some settings that say do not turn this off. And very quickly here, let's see if I can find this quickly. Under control panel. Oops. There it is. There we are. Manage wireless, manage network settings. There it is. So if you find this guy and under configure, see this right here? Allow the computer to turn off this device. You will want to uncheck this. Now my license is set to my Ethernet card, so I don't worry about this. But if this is set and your power, if you're allowing your machine to turn off your wireless card, if your license is assigned to that card, it causes a lot of headaches. So make sure that you go look for this if you're doing that and uncheck this, because if not, you'll have users coming screaming at you why all of a sudden when they plug in their into their landline or they unplug their battery, everything goes haywire. Okay, so very important to realize about doing something like that. You know, it helps you out. Okay, so just a little bit about licensing. Again, we can go into licensing for a few hours, to be honest with you, wanted to, but we have to kind of cut it off to move on. Okay, so software download, new stuff about essentially the PTC site, and then also some licensing, a little bit of protocol, and just some tips and tricks around it. Okay, setting up standards. All right, this is always a collaborative effort between me and any customer that I walk into. A lot of times I have to talk and talk about the concepts in Pro-E, but I can't tell them what they want to or what they should control. Right? A lot of the times this is really more on on their end. How granular do you want to get with your users on how do you control what they do and how do you control what they not do? Now there are some things that never should, you know, there's some things that never should be allowed, users should be allowed to change, right? Everyone should always be looking at the same start parts in Pro-E. Everyone should be using the same drawing formats. Most cases, there are very few times when you want users not to have the same Config.pro options. Now well, I shouldn't say all, but there are some things that we'll talk about here in just a second, but there are some config options that should never be or never allow the user to change. Materials, right? You want everybody looking at the same materials. Placing the trail files into certain directories. If you have UDFs, the .dtl options. For those of you that have the .dtl options, even now, more importantly, that .dtl file is even more important because now there can be two .dtl files. Because of PTC's advancements in the annotations within a part, right, putting in 3D annotations on parts, there is now a .dtl file that can be assigned to the part file that controls tolerancing standard, orientations, text look on your 3D annotation. So you can have a .dtl file for your part and then also now a .dtl file for your drawing. And you have to kind of make a nice marriage of the two to make it work how you want. I've kind of started to figure it out a little bit more, but it's been a little confusing the way they've been doing this. Also, some of the manufacturing options, if you have some manufacturing things that you're doing within Pro-E, there are a lot of different config options that you have that point to tools and do different things. But really what it comes down to is just like what it says here. What are the objects that we must control versus what should the user have the ability to change? Most companies don't care about colors. You can, but most don't. Do you really want to regulate everybody's screen is black, or everybody's screen is white, or everybody's screen is hot pink, whatever? Those are things that usually are decided within a group. What is acceptable for change and what is not acceptable for change. And we'll talk about how you kind of control what is and what is not. But for the most part, when I walk into a company, when we're talking about a non-wind chill environment, we usually will set up some type of folder structure on the server. We put all the information that is standard that we want to control out on the server. We break it down into folders to make it easy for you to be able to find that information, right? I might have a top-level folder that says Pro System and then have all of this, and then we segregate the things that matter that we want to control into some of these folders. Essentially, this is just a snapshot that is on my my computer that I have right here. So here are some of the things that I control, even though it's just me. It just makes it easier for me to point to some of those things. Okay. Also, any of you that are not using wind chill, there's a lot of questions around standard libraries. okay? Essentially, ProEngineer out of the box, and this is not a good thing, out of the box, is that if I have bolts and nuts and washers that I'm using across multiple products or assemblies, out of the box, you have to take that bolt and that nut and copy it into every single folder that you might segregate in for product A versus product B versus product C. Well, obviously the problem with that is you get a lot of duplication, okay? So when you are not using a wind chill system, the only way around doing all of that duplicate data is to use essentially search paths. And you use something called a search.pro and search paths within that search.pro to point it. So the way that it works is that you can put only components that are unique to job A in the job A folder. You then would put anything that is standard library, whether it's, again, hardware components or any other standard library stuff, right, that you might create that you use, into a folder somewhere on the server. And all you do, and I can show you this here quick, let's minimize that, is that you can create a search.pro that says search path and it has a path to look. And so what happens is when you open up an assembly, once you go to open up that assembly, ProEngineer will first look in the working directory for a component. If it does not find it in the component, all you have to do at that point in time is list, right, essentially the paths that you want to look for. So it could say, C, in my case, Pro System Library Components, it could be /bolts, and then /nuts for the next one, and then /this one, and then /this one. And then that way, you can put those components, do not have to duplicate them. You're putting them into a library. You can control the access permissions on the library. One of the more key things to this is that usually you only give read access to everyone else except for a few that have access to change those components. The reason you do that is because obviously if you go into the library and you change a whole bunch of components and everyone is using them, when they open up their assemblies, everything falls apart. Okay, so you give them read access only permissions on those folders. It goes, grabs that component, it brings it in, and then again, you don't have to duplicate all this. So when you are not in a wind chill environment, this really is the only way to prevent component duplication from folder to folder to satisfy the natural behavior of the software. Right? These are called search paths, and you use it with essentially a config file that says, I'm going to use this search.pro, and then you have search paths that just describe the folders that you want to work out of. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to set up. That's pretty much the way you get that done. Minimize that. All right. Again, just like we talked about, what do you allow a user to do? When I say anything that has to do with model behavior, right? Do you care? Do Pro-E admins really care that the datum tag's wrong? Do you really care about that? If your users care and they want them off, those are things you don't control. Coloring schemes, those type of things. Config settings, color files, your .ui. Now, the .ui, well, I shouldn't say .ui, but your user interface, for those of you that are not using Creo, you could add in map keys and map keys as far as buttons, and you can take buttons in and out of Pro-E Wildfire 5. In Creo 1 and in Creo 2.0, they made the interface much more changeable compared to what it is in previous versions. Okay, so you have the ability to control what users do or do not see, and it's not a Config.win anymore. Okay, so the Config.win has essentially gone away. So when you start talking about this, how do you deal with that? You kind of decide to deal with it, whether again through config files or not. But you have config.wins or Wildfire 5, and you have .ui files, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Okay. So again, what do you allow your users to control compared to what do you don't? All right, so that takes care of kind of our standards and short discussions around standards. Unfortunately, we could talk about this for a while, but we've got to keep moving to reach our hour. Okay. All right. So config files. This is a big thing. There really are three different types of config files that ProEngineer/Creo uses. There's the interface files. So if you're Wildfire 5, it's Config.win. If it is Creo, it is now there is no more Config.win. It's a specific name, and I have to look at it within their .ui file. So the Config.win has gone away, but they still behave exactly the same. So you have all of your interface objects, and then you also have your Config.pro and then your Config.sup. For those of you that have done some admin stuff before, everybody usually knows about the Config.win, and now it's .ui. Everybody usually knows what a Config.pro is, okay, but a lot of my users have not used a Config.sup. And so Config.sup, if you think of it this way, is the way that you lock down options that you don't want users to change, okay? So pointing towards certain start parts, pointing towards formats, making sure the config options that do all of your search path type ideas. Those are things that you would want to do in a config.sup. And so the way that ProEngineer Creo works is that it reads options, all of these options in a specific order. And so the first one, okay, the first one that ProEngineer will read actually, if you have it, is a config.sup. And once it reads a config.sup, any other option that is described in a config.pro from that point will not be read. So I can put in all of my start parts are in this location in a config.sup, and if I had that same option in a config.pro, it won't get used. It'll only use the option in the config.sup. So the way that it works is that usually this is, there's a number of different variations of this, is that you will take a config.pro or sup from your server and copy it into the install point of ProEngineer. And the reason you copy it down here is because the way that ProEngineer reads it is not only config.sup, config.pro, but it also reads it in this specific order right here. Okay? So usually when I go into a customer, I will put a config.sup, actually batch file a config.sup into the startup location because that's the first thing that I want ProEngineer or Creo to read. I usually don't set this up. We'll talk about this here in just a second. And then in the start in folder, which is right here, all of the user-based config options will exist in the start in directory. And so the way that it works is that when they fire up ProEngineer or Creo, it'll look at the config.sup, the stuff that's unchangeable first. Then it'll look at the config.pro and this guy, and if anything is duplicated from this or from this one into here, it won't pay attention to it, and that's the way you can control your user's ability to add in objects to the config.pro and just change them. So if you're really looking to control what they're trying to do, you use a config.sup, you put it into their text directory, and you allow the user's config.pro to be in the start-in folder. That's the way that it works. All of the config.win and config.ui, they can exist either in the start-in point or they can exist in the start-in folder. It's just kind of where you want to control it from. All right. Now, most cases, most companies will just use this spot right here. Here it is for Creo, and here it is for Wildfire 5, and then the start-in. One of the lesser-known ones is in the login directory. Now, when we say login directory, essentially when you log into your machine, right? If you have some type of LDAP system, you log into your machine, you have a login directory that you essentially can pull information from. What you could do, and I don't do this very often, is that you could put a config.pro in that user's login directory. So if they go from machine to machine to machine, whenever they log in, they could actually take their config files with them from machine to machine because you could put this config.pro into essentially this login directory, right? So when they log into machine A, it'll pull that config. When they log into machine B, it'll pull that config, right? So the way, if you're using all three of these, the way that ProEngineer loads in order is from the install point, from the login directory, and then from the start-in folder. Most companies I have don't use this right here, but you can. Okay, they just use the start or the install point and then the start-in folder. But again, that is the order. So if you didn't know this and you didn't know that login directory, it allows users to move from one to the next, and it makes it a little bit easier for you to get around to those things. Okay. All right. So a little bit about config files and the ideas around them. Again, we could talk about them for a little bit while longer, but I need to keep pushing to get into our last little discussion topic. Okay. All right. Batch files. Batch files. Okay. So this is what I use, and these are very, very simple ideas when it comes to creating batch files. Essentially, you could create batch files that do a whole bunch of stuff. And they can take stuff away, they can set up environment settings, they can delete stuff, they can add stuff, they can rename things, they can do a number of different things. But the way that I use batch files in a very simple form is to make sure that when a user starts up ProEngineer that they get the appropriate config files so that everyone can work off the same one. So for example, if we want the users all to work off one exact config, whether it's config.sup or it's a config.pro, what we can do is every single time they start it up, essentially, instead of actually starting, and I'll show you this here, there we are, is instead of actually running ProE right here, what they actually run is this batch file, okay? That's the batch file. And what the batch file says is that if I edit this guy, it says every single time you start up ProE, I want you to delete the current config.pro. And in this case, I also want you to delete the trail files. Now that's not necessary, it's just something for some maintenance on your machine. It then says I want you to copy this config file from, in this case it could be a server, and put it into this point. And then I want you to start ProE. Now what makes this nice is that instead of you having to go around and changing every single user's Config.pro when you want to update it, you could put it on the server and then copy it so when they start ProE, they are going to get a fresh copy of whatever the most current config file, and whether it's a config.pro or config.sup, or even if you want to control the interface in that form. Okay? So this batch file runs, it deletes the current config, again trail file, it copies the one from the server, it puts it into the correct startup point, and then again it starts Creo Parametric. Okay? So this is the batch file that it runs. There it is. And again, just so you can kind of see how this works, there it is. There's the work that it's doing. There's the file that it copied and placed it in there. At this point in time, Creo Parametric will open sooner or later. There it is. I haven't fired up Creo Parametric today, so it's a first time fire up today. There it is. And then if I come down into Files, Options, this is why I get all of these options right here. And again, if I wanted to change these, right, if I wanted to do it at the server level for everybody, I would go in, I would change it on the server. When I shut down ProE, and then I would open it back up, it would copy in the new one into the install point, and then I would be using that specific config and not this old config. This really is the best way to essentially standardize what configs a user is or is not using, and especially if you want to break it down to where you are preventing them from doing things. Instead of doing a config.pro, you would do a config.sup, and it just makes it easy excuse me, for you to be able to do those things. Okay? So just a little bit about config files and how that's done. All right. I'm going to take the last 4 minutes, and again I'll leave the last 10 minutes open if there are any questions. There are a lot of times that I set this up at customers, and this is a nice little thing to do every once in a while. There's a lot of times when you have a number of different licenses, and we're getting away from batch file stuff. I just kind of brought this up, but if you have a number of different, or let's say you have 5 different users, but you only have 2 seats of advanced assembly, or if you have 4 different users, or you only have 1 seat of flexible modeling, and you want to be able to share that. Well, those are essentially as you grab them modules. Once you grab them, you have it. And then even if you're not using it, if you grab it, you have it. So how can you control who gets what license at any given time? So if you never done this, and see, I'll get here quickly here, and I'll just do it for the Wildfire 5 one. If you've never done this, you have the ability to create license configurations for you essentially install a Pro E. Okay, so if I go to PTC setup, if you've never done this, again, I come in here. If I get to additional license configurations, okay, what you have the ability to do is by default, if you've ever been through this interface right here, most everybody will pick this guy right here and they'll hit edit, and essentially here is all of the objects that you own, okay? So what you have the ability to do is create multiple configurations of licenses. So for instance, in this case, I only want this configuration right here to pull this rep license. And I'll say, okay, what I can do is say I want to add another rep. And so I'll say I now want to call it the Ben rep, or you could say it's the Pro E rep with AX. And I'll say I want to pull training, and then I also want to pull expert machinists. Okay? I'll say, okay, I'll do a configure, right? And then what happens is that when you fire up Pro E, instead of you just grabbing everything or whatever is available, you will have the choice of picking specific configurations. So as soon as this gets done running here, and it takes just a second, here we are. Let's go ahead and minimize this stuff. When I fire this up, notice how you get the two different configurations. So you essentially can move individual modules back and forth. So it could be, hey, I just want everybody to have the option for base Pro E. And then I want everybody to have the option for Pro Engineer with AX. And then it with the rendering. And then with flexible modeling. So it's not the just horde grab that you get when your users come in and everybody has to come out and get back in. And how do we regulate that? And how do we do that? You can do that with licensing or essentially startup configurations. The batch files still work. It is just a configuration that you create that makes it easy for you to control what licenses your users are or are not getting. Okay, there we are. So just a kind of a little bit tidbit. Didn't necessarily have that in the agenda, but it's a great way to control what licenses users do or do not get, because a lot of licenses now that PTC hands out, you cannot just say get rid of them. When you start them up, you have to pull it at the time of startup, and you can't let it go. So it just makes it easier for you to deal that way. Okay. A lot of generalities that we covered in this, this webcast. Just kind of hopefully get you thinking a little bit. I'll now put this, give this time. Let's see if there's any questions at this time. Let's see here. All right, so Bob, you have a question? Maybe this is outside the scope. Can you talk about using setup trail files for silent installs? I'm going to make this work. Any tips? Okay. Okay. So silent installs. All right. I have heard a lot about this, and I have made this a to-do on my list to do this, but depending on what version you are using, PTC now, if you look at the reference documents for the installer for Creo 2, includes a silent installer with it, but I haven't used it yet. Okay. Now, for older versions of the software, just because I haven't had to do that in the past, I just never got into it too much. But it is something, Bob, if you need a little bit more information about it, maybe I can find some of the install experts at PTC, maybe to give it, maybe to hunt down a little bit more. I know there are, I started to look into the silent installer type things. There are other softwares. You can Google silent installers, and there are silent installer softwares that you actually, I don't know if you purchase them or if they're free, more than likely you probably have to purchase them. But you actually can use those and do installs based off it, whether they work well or not. Honestly, I've never tried to get one to work off of a trail file, but I think PTC is going to that. It's a term that's kind of getting a little bit more popular as far as installing and making it easy. In Creo 2, there is now, quote unquote, a silent installer. I haven't got a chance to work, but it is there. If you look at one of the very last appendixes of Creo 2 install manual, you will see the chapter on silent installer. I just haven't had a chance to use it. So I know that's not a definite answer for you, Bob, but if you send me an email, let me put this let me put this stuff back up here. Maybe I'll be able to get a little information for you, okay? All right. So, John, let's see here. I need a way to expand this. Let's see if I can expand it that way. Oh, there we go. Much easier. Okay, a very long time ago, one used to be able to run a batch file for printing many plots of drawing without having to open each drawing in Pro-E, okay? How can this be accomplished now? Okay, so there is, what is it, batch.pro? What is that now? Oh, John, I cannot believe what it's called. I can't remember what it's called now. I'll have to. I think it's used to be the oh man, I cannot remember that for the life of me what it's called now. But essentially, there used to be batching, and you can still do that. They call it a little bit something different now. Essentially, it's like batching, but they call it something else, and I don't know why. It's on the tip of my tongue. I just can't remember it for this time. You still can do that within Pro-E. Essentially, there's the little icon that you get right here. It's the batch scripting object that you essentially can go in and say, I want to create PDFs based off of this folder or this directory. You can do it that way. There's a lot of companies that will do it that way. They will also do it through some little bit more complicated programming type systems like JLink and some other programming languages. But there is now the there it is, dbatch. There it is. So dbatch. So dbatch essentially is where you can do that at and still run those type of things. So I would look into that, John, and see if you can get something out of it. If you're looking for a little bit more information on it, I think I have some slides. I actually honestly think I have some slides on it. Send me an email, and I'll try to get you those slides on it. There's also a good resource that we use, a gentleman by the name of Matt Meadows that used to work in PTC that knows a lot about that also. So if you're really looking to do something and you'd like a little bit more information, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll get that over to you. All right. Let's see. No, Bob. For Creo Elements 5, no. There is not, at least from what I looked at, there is not a silent installer for essentially Wildfire 5. That is all going to have to be done, again, by trial and error or by using some third party. I saw the silent installer for Creo, and I don't even think it was Creo 1. It was for Creo 2, to be honest with you. And so essentially the idea here, is that once you essentially set all of your config or all of the options and install points, you essentially can just pick a button on individual computers and it does the install for you. But again, I can't, until I actually use it, I won't promote it to actually to say whether it's great or not. So no, it's not for Creo 5, unfortunately, or Wildfire 5, Creo 2 only. All right. I will keep essentially the web session open for another 5 minutes here. If there are any other questions that come across, if there are any questions that don't come through at this point in time and you still would like to have something answered, please feel free to shoot me an email. There you are right there. Okay, shoot me an email. This is my cell phone number. I do answer it most of the time. But go ahead and throw some things at me. If I don't have the answer, I usually can get a hold of somebody that might know a little bit more information in certain cases. Excuse me, that I could point you into that direction. Pro-E admin work is not a well researched in a PDF document that you can find. You pick things up from guys that know how. One thing that I will do, if you guys are not, if anybody on the line that is really looking for some things and you are not a part of the PTC blogs, the PTC user blog for Pro-E admin, I will encourage you, greatly encourage you to get on the PTC user blogs. There are a lot of guys that have been doing it for 15, 20 years that put information out on those blogs, especially on the user blogs. On the user forums, and you can ask questions. They're really good guys. They know their stuff. There's some really smart guys out there. And since we're all a community, they do respond to a lot of things that you put out there. I pay attention to those. I pick things up here and there from them. They are really, really good resources to use. So if you're not a part of those, if you're not getting those PTC user emails and you're not part of the Pro eAdmin one, I will highly, highly encourage you. Usually you get some good results from that, and you can ask a lot of questions. So Bob, if you're not on there, I would definitely ask that question and see if anybody out there has tried a silent installer for Wildfire 5. Okay, so use them. They're usually pretty good. They help out a whole bunch. For the most part, again, this is the end of the webcast. If you don't have a question and you're itching to go, feel free. You won't miss anything except for maybe a question answer. If not, that'll be about it. Okay. So again, I'll stay on the line here for just a few. What time is it? Just a few more minutes, and then we will we'll end it, and hopefully we'll see you here next time we have a webcast.